Bruins Beat is brought to you by Prizepicks.
And welcome into the Bruins Beat, presented by Prizepicks. Go use that promo code CLNS to get $50 back when you play just $5. I'm Evan Marinofsky. That is Conor Ryan. Connor, what is up?
Evan, I'm doing well. How you doing?
Doing great. It's, Connor, we like to think that, we know what to talk about. We have our finger on the pulse. So I'm gonna actually ask you this. What do you think we should talk about today? You think we should talk about the Bruins 1-0 loss to the Minnesota Wild on Sunday, and we can maybe even sprinkle in the win on Saturday with the Penguins, and get a little positivity? Or do we talk trade deadline? With that,
let's talk the trade deadline, please. Evan, I was actually out this weekend. I was golfing down in Myrtle Beach. Enjoyed some of the nice weather down there. So I followed along, but not obviously as intently as I usually am with Bruins games. And all things considered, feels like I didn't miss much, especially that game on Sunday. So I don't know how much time we actually want to spend talking about the product on the ice. I would much rather talk about what's going on moving forward.
There is zero chance. You and I could have been at both games and, done analysis and everything, and I still wouldn't pick those two games. Trade deadline's the big story this week. Obviously, it's it's Friday at 3 p.m. We've been talking about the deadline for a really long time because I think that's been the major storyline with this team, is this team that every year buys, that every year is in contention, and they're still technically in contention, but not really. They aren't probably going to be buyers this year, and I want to kind of dissect that, dive into it, because this is the last episode I'm doing with Bruins Beat prior to the trade deadline. So this is sort of our last gasp at takes and what we think is going to happen and kind of breaking things down. And we'll start here. So Anthony DeMarco from Daily Faceoff tweeted earlier on Monday, sounds like the Flames have reached out. I love when people use the hashtags. Hashtag Flames, hashtag NHL Bruins. Can someone let me know? And I don't mean to be a dick, because this is a dick thing. Does anybody actually, when they want to look up what their favorite team's doing, do they actually type in like hashtag NHL Bruins? I think you just type in Bruins or Flames.
Yeah. I don't know if there's some sort of metric to it, but I sure don't.
I haven't touched a hashtag since Vietnam.
Yes.
So anyway, sounds like the Flames have reached out to Bruins defenseman, or reached out on Bruins defenseman Brandon Carlo.
They call Carlo directly.
Yeah, I was going to say, hello, Brandon. Would you like to come to Calgary? Teams have yet to dive into details, but Calgary is interested. Not too many players on Boston's roster not available for the right price. Got to say that 3 times fast. Not too many players available. Not too many players on Boston's roster not available for the right price. So I'm going to deduct that guys are available for right prices. I think that's what he means. But we'll start with Carlo, because that's new, and we've touched on Carlo a little bit on could he be a guy that moves. He has some term after this year. I mentioned, especially after the Four Nations with Jacob Slavin being as good as he was. Carlo obviously isn't Jacob Slavin, but he is a really good shutdown defender. I know he's regressed this season, but overall still, a guy that you'd like in your top 4 come the playoffs, especially if you're a contending team. And I did look, Calgary has 2 firsts this year. Calgary has 2 first-round picks. Now, I think they are, they're tied to some other teams. I don't have it right in front of me. But I believe they have 2 first-round picks. So I don't know. To me, I love Brandon Carlo. I think he's a leader. I think he's the guy you want on your team. But if someone came along with a first and maybe a prospect or just a good price, I'd have a hard time shooting that down.
Yeah, I think it comes down to the price, right? Because as you said, I know that Brandon Carlo can kind of be a polarizing player. I think when he's on his game, it's not like he's the most flashy, the style of play that he has out there, but it is effective when he's locked in and you can see his value. So I wouldn't give him up unless you are getting bowled over with, whether it's a first, good young play, a young player that is part of, I think, what the Bruins are looking to do, which is kind of retool on the fly with a younger player that has more value. And I think Carlo is one of your more appealing trade chips. Like, there's a lot of guys on this roster that, as you said, I'm not going to repeat the same way it was phrased. I'm gonna mess it up if I do it the same way. But I think you look at if the Bruins are leaving no stone unturned in terms of gauging players' values and listening in on every single player. Carlo, I think, is one of the few guys realistically, like, I'm not putting, obviously the franchise guys like Pasternak and McAvoy, and it remains to be seen if they would listen in on like a Lori or a Patra, right? Whereas I think they're more inclined to keep those kinds of players unless it is for a bigger deal or something like that. But Carlo is one of those guys that in and of himself could get you a pretty solid return, right? A guy who's right shot D, plays a style of hockey that I think a lot of teams covet, just has that stability, right? Of 20 minutes a night can anchor your PK. Not a lot of guys that can do that, especially signed for another 2 years at 4.1 million. So, there's the guys like Frederick and Brazeau that are pending, UFAs. So it seems like a foregone conclusion that they are going to be gone. But even then, what are you going to get from them? Marchand's the other guy that, could have value. But again, I'm sure we're going to talk more about him. But another one where there's a lot of weight to what you're doing there, what his long-term plans are, everything like that. Charlie Coyle is a guy that I think a lot of teams would covet, but I don't know if it's going to be as high as a guy like Carlo. So, yeah, I think Carlo is really an intriguing piece that I think you can get a solid return, whether that is a first, whether it is a young player, a prospect, or he could be part of a bigger trade if it is, you're moving out pieces, but you're getting a good young player back, right? Like, it's, I don't think he would be the centerpiece of like, I saw that the Kings are putting up something on Byfield. Like, I don't think that he'd be a piece for that or a headliner, but that would be a piece that you'd imagine if they're looking at moving out a young player, he'd be a guy that they'd covet taking back. So I'm not saying that it's Byfield for Carlo. Don't clip this, Evan.
Clipped.
Everyone, yeah, please don't do that. But he's a guy that I think a lot of teams are like, oh, what do you have to offer? We could use him. We could use a guy like Brendan Carlo. And I think a lot of teams are like that, whether it's teams that are contending now, teams kind of on the upswing and the come up, like a Columbus that needs some like a veteran guy that's going to be here for a couple of years. There's a lot of appeal to what Brendan Carlo has. Now, I also think that it just is going to come down to if the Bruins are going to get bowled over by a price, because the Bruins have to weigh what the path is going forward. We can all kind of view it as like, all right, this year I think is shot to hell. They got to kind of retool on the fly. But for the Bruins, like as you're kind of processing this scenario of this deadline, which no one really expected, especially them, of being in a spot where they are entertaining being sellers, like you also have to look at it. All right, this year ain't it. We got to retool. Are we realistically looking at a 3-4 year retool, or are we looking at like an aggressive offseason and like we can kind of get back on track? And again, that's not to say, again, if they do that, if you just are going to try to get the same template as the Capitals, like good luck. They got Ryan Leonard and they've drafted well, and they've also, landed a lot of really strong trades the last couple of years or moves that just have benefited them. You have to like, strike gold on a lot of moves like that. And there's no guarantee they can do that. But are the Bruins looking at this as like, we can get back on track next, during this offseason, and we don't have to worry about moving a guy like Carlo or Marchand because we think they're going to help us out right away next year. Like put this year in the trash, move forward. Or is it 2-3 years down the road and we have to maximize, if this is our one kind of crappy year, let's quote unquote make it count in terms of really kind of ripping off the Band-Aid and kind of getting the uncomfortable, painful part of it out of the way right now, as opposed to maybe prolonging it even further. So it's a really fascinating spot for the Bruins to be in. I think we all know what they need to do, but how far are they going to do that, right? Or what do they realistically think is going to be the path? Is this, hey, if we free up some money and allocate it the right way in free agency and get an impact player and then move do a move similar to like the Zacha trade, or like finding another Geekie, a guy that, you look at his numbers and yes, he's not going to cost that much, but we could see being in the spot he'd be with the Bruins, He would really thrive, right? Like that's not out of the question to trying to make a hockey trade like a Zacha and try to find value like a Geekie and kind of reshuffling things and being back on track next year. But is that just fool's gold? Is that not realistic? Do the Bruins think that there's a time to really kind of change things? It's right now. So it's really fascinating as to how aggressive they are going to be in terms of moving out assets. Because it could be Frederick and Brazeau, or it could be a whole lot more. Like that, I think, is the big question.
I was going to say, if you're just doing Frederick, Brazeau, even like a peak, you're looking at next year and saying, we can get right back into competing next year. I think when you start to move Carlo and even a Coyle, I do think that's when it's, okay, this could be a 2 to 3 year thing. And Marchand signals a similar thing. If you're trading Marchand, it's likely probably a 2 to 3 year retool. Now, you mentioned an interesting point with Carlo. If they want to compete next year, he helps you. Now, if you know there's a better alternative down the road, if you can acquire that via a trade or free agency for a top 4 defenseman, then that's great, right? Like on the right side. But if you take Carlo out of the equation, you have Lindholm, Lohrei, and Zadorov on the left side, and you basically just got McAvoy on the right. Andrew Peeke you could throw in there as well, but does he get dealt too? Is he going to be a top 4 D-man next year if he's back? What's his role going to be? So I think it comes, if you're trading Carlo, you're right. It is likely a 2 to 3 year window. And that's what makes him so valuable is he can come into any team right now and be a top 4 guy, play really hard minutes, play PK, he's a guy you want on your side come the cup, come the playoffs. He can take those tough matchups. So, would I trade him? It would have to be the right price. I know that's like an easy duh answer, but I mean, I think a right price for him is a first and a prospect or a younger player with terms similar sort of to what Jonas Siegel gave as like what Coyle would get from the Leafs of like a first and a young roster player with some control. I think Carlo's the same, if not a little more. You hit on it with like top 4 right shot defensemen like that. You can't just go anywhere and get those guys. And you take into account that he's a good leader and all those things. He's a valuable asset and he'd be valuable to this team going forward. So for me, and I think it's the same I have this similar take with Marchand where it's like, yes, he would help you next year 100%. And you want his leadership. But if someone came along and knocked your socks off with a trade offer, how do you not pull the trigger? And I imagine the Bruins think they can go right back to competing next year. They spent a lot of money this offseason. They have Pasternak in his prime. They have McAvoy in his prime. Full year of Swayman. We've talked about this a number of times. Of the pieces could be in place to go right back to competing next year. But someone comes along for Marchand or Carlo, and it's a lot. How do you shoot that down? I know a lot of people, it's easy to be like, no, you need Marchand forever, and he's a Bruin forever. And I agree, it would be awesome if he could be a Bruin forever. But, the team's going to go on much longer than Brad Marchand's going to play for. You do have to account for the future a little bit. And the reality is that there aren't a lot of good young guys coming up. They haven't made a lot of picks. They haven't gotten a lot for talent that's left. And they might be at that final stage where it's like, you've got to get you've got to get something for Marchand. Frederick, obviously, you got to get something for Frederick, So I don't know. Do you sense what direction they might be headed in at the moment?
In terms of retaining or how they view this retool?
How they view the deadline. Because if they think it's a 2 to 3 year rebuild, then I would think, okay, yeah, Carlo would probably go out the door. Whereas if they don't, then no.
I would lean more towards them being cautious, and I think that's what Don Sweeney mentioned multiple times in his press conference last week, and I think cautious also can mean boring. So does that mean it's just Frederick and Brazeau? Maybe. But I think it all just comes down to what the prices are. The market can fluctuate, in the days leading up to the deadline. If there's not a lot of teams that are selling, even so, the Blues who have won a couple of games, it's I don't think Schen's getting moved now where they view themselves as maybe making a push for that final wild card spot. So if guys like that are off the board, does a team then pivot to Charlie Coyle as a veteran third line player? Do they look at again, Marchand as someone that they'd give up a price for? So I think it all comes down to, for the Bruins, it's listening in on all of these pieces, whether it's Carlo, Morgan Geekie even, which I think Elliot Friedman said on 32 Thoughts is a guy that is still getting a lot of interest. So you have to weigh that as well. But so I think it comes down to what the asking price is. And for the Bruins, just how realistic is it to think they can kind of get back on track? Because also maybe it's something where, if the price is that good and you still think that you can kind of right the ship after this offseason, if someone's offering you friggin' Byfield or something for Carlo and you make the pieces work, right? Then you're like, all right, yeah, we'll take the 22-year-old center and we'll spend $4 million to bring in a right shot D. They can view it as that as well. So I think for the Bruins, they're open to however they want to gauge moving off some of these pieces. I don't think they're just going to outright say no unless it's 88 or 73 or guys like that. But it all comes down to, how much can they be swayed in terms of what these offers are? Because if someone is going to give you a first and a young player for Carlo, okay, then you have to see the forest over the trees and be like, listen, it's going to be tough to replace him this year. This team's going to probably bottom out even more, which honestly, if it's for the final 20 games and it means you're picking 6th or 7th overall as opposed to 11th, so you do that, and then if you got that money freed up, you allocate that money elsewhere. And maybe it's a guy that doesn't have as high as a ceiling as Carlo, but a guy that can play no frills, simple hockey play 18, 19 minutes a night, and you sign that guy in free agency. That's how you put the Band-Aid on. If by making that means that you got pieces for the future, and it also helps you further move up the draft leaderboard this year. So it's, again, I feel like we are once again, Evan, doing the Charlie Kelly of all the domino effects of these things, but it shows you just where the Bruins are. Like, we know, I think, what path they should take and which path they are going to take. It's just how far do you go in terms of selling off those assets?
Well, that's my thing. It's like, I would like to see them do a little bit of a retool. I would you've mentioned this before too, of sort of trimming the fat. And I'm not saying Brendan Carlo is fat on this roster, or Charlie Coyle is fat on this roster, but they do have value and they can help you for the future. And, the reality is, couldn't you find a guy who can do something similar to Charlie Coyle, either in free agency or via a trade, as a third line center? Brendan Carlo is going to be harder to find. That's why you get more in return. But to me, I like, historically, even the years they were retooling, I know this is a long time ago, but even in, the mid 2010s, they didn't have crazy deadlines. They did small things. And that's why if I had to make a prediction, I think it's like Frederick and Brazeau. I don't think they are doing fireworks this year. But I'd be happy to be wrong, because I don't think that's what they should do. I think what they should do is, and I think they are doing this, listening on those top guys and pulling the trigger a little bit and saying, all right, let's get an extra first. Let's get 2 seconds. Like, let's get a prospect. So I'm all for that. Morgan Geekie is a really interesting one. Geekie is a fascinating one. I think people are split on it. I did see some tweets on Monday morning of a lot of people being like, I think might have been Peter Tenkrat on Twitter. I think it was him. I don't want to mix up my parody accounts, but I think it was him who asked, like, what?
That's actually Peter Tenkrat.
That is Peter Tenkrat. Yes, that is the real Peter Tenkrat. So I'm wondering what people think sort of they should do with Geekie. And a lot of people were like, sell, sell, sell. I want to get into that. But first, our friends over at Prizepicks. Prizepicks is the best place to get real money sports action with over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings. Prizepicks has made daily fantasy sports accessible to all. You just pick more or less on at least 2 players for a shot to win up to 1,000 times your cash. Run your game all season long over at Prizepicks. Prizepicks invented the flex play, which means you can still cash out if your lineup isn't perfect. You can double your money even if one of your picks doesn't hit. And Prizepicks, they put their members first. Like, when you're in Prizepicks, you're in the driver's seat, baby. And all withdrawals are fast, safe, and secure. When my picks hit, I can get my money in as quick as 15 minutes. And Prizepicks now offers a MasterCard for quick and easy deposits into your account this sports season. Bruins-wise, Pasternak's point streak is over, but I maybe he's going to start a new one. I like Pasternak. Keep hammering that.
I like Pasternak too, Evan.
Yeah, Pasternak's a watchable guy. He's fun. So Pasternak would be my guy. And we're about to talk about it, but Morgan Geekie. Geekie's been really solid, so that's another one. Download the app today and use code CLNS to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, download the app and use code CLNS to get $50 instantly after you play that first $5 lineup. Prizepicks, run your game. Run your game over at Prizepicks. So Morgan Geekie, pending RFA, so the Bruins can just kind of keep him. It's not, you got to sign him, obviously, but this is not, other teams aren't going to be bidding for him unless they put up an offer sheet. A lot of value, though. And a guy who's been arguably like your second or third best forward, 19 goals this year, shooting at like 17%, which is bananas. Bananas. Much higher than any other year of his career. Now, We've talked about him before. I think we talked about him like a little over a month ago in sort of what they should do with Morgan Geekie. And we both kind of like, yeah, hold on to him. Re-sign him. He works. And I still feel that way. I mean, I think you look at his fit and he fits with Pastrnak. And I'm not saying he's going to be Pasternak's long-term wing, but he does fit there. And you have no depth on the wings. Now, if you can get a first and a high-end prospect, or a first and a young player with roster control, then yes, then I'm for that. Like if you can get a higher end skill guy, then sure. But if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So like there's also that end to it too. And I think Geekie falls in the same category as a Carlo, as a Coyle of, if you get a good price, then absolutely yes. But if it's just a second round pick or a third round pick for Geekie, if that's what people think the rate is, although Gus Nyquist just got a second round pick. So like maybe the prices are going to go up. But if Geekie can get himself, if you can get a first, or even package him for a good young player, then you have to do that, I think. But again, if the price is not right, then I'm not in a rush to just deal him off.
Yeah, I think it just comes down to the price, right? Because again, the same as Carlo, if you are the Bruins and you're looking at this offseason, I think you can really right the ship and get back at it. Yeah, I think he can help you. Same with Carlo. Like, and whether that means on the top line with Pastrnak, or even if he gets bumped down, I think he's still a guy that can be effective, plays his game, plays a physical game, puts pucks on net. He could help you out kind of wherever if you add more talent. It's not like if the Bruins friggin' sign Rantanen this offseason, they're going to be like, oh, Rantanen, you're going to move down. Like, we got to set this spot for Geekie. Like, we know that.
Yes.
But it just comes down to what the price is. If it is like a second and you have that team control over the guy because he's an RFA, yeah, I'd probably be more inclined to keeping him because, as you said, there's the depth that he provides is something that is useful for the Bruins, both for now and in the years ahead. But if it is a first, then it's kind of the same things I mapped out, maybe the talking point with Carlo, where it's like, all right, if we get a first and a young player and we move up the money and we can sign we can recreate what he provides in the aggregate, the Bruins could be like, hey, if we get a first round pick for a guy that we took a flyer on and hit a home run with, and we can try to find another similar player, or instead of spending money on him on this new deal, we get a first and we can allocate that money elsewhere and either try to find another diamond in the rough, or again, use it to sign another top six player to put with Pastrnak. Like, I think it just comes down to the price. I think both scenarios work out for the Bruins. Like, I'm not going to hem and haw over either one of them. If you get a first for Geekie, it stinks like that he's not here, but like that you're maximizing his value, and it falls on what the Bruins should be doing of selling and looking to the future. But if it's not going to be a worthwhile return, and we're not going to find that out, Don Sweeney's not going to go on Friday and be like, well, if someone was to give me a first, yeah, maybe I would actually have, he would do that. But
the Oilers offered a third round pick. Would you want to do that? Like, he's not going to do that.
Exactly. But so I think it does come down to maximizing the return. So I wouldn't move Geekie for the sake of doing it just because you're announcing that you're selling. It has to be for the right price. And I think that's those guys like Geekie and Carlo and Coyle all fit in that same category, that they probably will help you next year if you are really committed to turning things around pretty quick. But if the price is right, then I don't think you'd be doing your job as a GM, especially already acknowledging you have to look towards the future if you're holding on to him when a team is offering a piece that can really help you out. Like, if you're the Bruins and you get multiple firsts this year by moving Carlo and Geekie, you can restock your system, not even counting the first that you already have that keeps on going higher and higher.
In the first round last time.
Where have we seen this before?
Perfect.
But it gives you capital, right? Of like, not only can you ideally use some of those picks and get young talent that hopefully can help you out in the next couple of years, you can also, if you have three, you don't feel as bad about moving one of them if it means they're getting a legitimate piece back. So, like if it falls in line with the Bruins are doing, and you are trying to be aggressive and you're making hockey trades, you're trying to make that next move for a Zaka, right? Like what you did a few years ago, or like look at all the times that the Capitals taking in guys whose value is low, like Dubois, taking on money that way, or selling low or buying low on a guy like Strome, who's become a great player there. There's options, and teams get desperate. Teams are looking to move guys that are stagnant where they are. But you also need just the capital. The Bruins have a few pieces like Carlo and Geekie. That's why I keep on talking about them, because they're also not chock full of guys that teams are clamoring, I think, to necessarily take off their hands beyond, a second round pick or stuff like that. And the Bruins need to find ways to bring in young talent and also impactful talent. And so if it means moving a guy like Geekie that can get you that first or as part of a bigger package, I think you got to listen in on those.
I agree. And I think Geekie, as you said, falls in that category of listen. Like, and
Yeah.
I think a lot of people want I see some fans mentioning they want, seismic changes. How can you trade Pasternak for someone?
Yeah, no.
And can it be Swayman? It's not those guys. It's that next tier. It's Carlo. It's Coyle. It's Geekie. And it's not that you have to trade those guys. You don't have to trade Brad Marchand. Obviously, can't let him walk in the offseason, but I don't think he's inclined to doing so. But if the right price comes along, like, how do you not? Especially with guys like Geekie and Carlo. So I think that's sort of, I stand in that area too, of like, if you're just trading him, if you're trading any of those four just to trade them, like, I think nothing could be worse for this franchise than if they dealt Marchand for a very small amount. It's like Marchand for a second and like a low end prospect.
Yeah, no, what are you
doing?
doing?
What are you doing? Like, there's
unless
literally
like, and again, he wouldn't say it, but on Friday, Sweeney's like, we weren't going to sign him. Like, it's like, if you say the quiet part out loud of like, if Marchand, we find out that he wants to, he gets to July and he signs elsewhere for 3 years at $7 million a year. Okay, the Bruins weren't going to do that, right? If it's like a similar thing as like the Stamkos situation where he wants term and suitable pay for a guy that has taken a team-friendly deal for years now, which I wouldn't begrudge him for, but I can see why the Bruins would have some hesitancy to do that. Then maybe it's you're moving him just for anything, just to get that value. But again, I don't know if that's the case, Sweeney would just come out and say that. Because if it is like Marchand for a second, you're like, I'd rather just have Marchand. But
yes,
there's a whole lot of, especially for this year where the Bruins, their timeline moving forward is so murky and so tough to kind of parse out what is the best path and just how realistic is it for them to get back on track within a year or two. It makes so many variables and so many different factors that all kind of tie into where this team's line of thinking is right now. It's fascinating, but also means it's a lot of like, ask me again on Friday, because you can make compelling arguments however way you want to look at it, right, Evan, of who they should sell, whether it's right to really be aggressive with it, whether it's better to be conservative, and you think you can kind of get back on track. It's you kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't, the way that it's going right now with how the Bruins are approaching things.
it is. I think there's also the argument, should Don Sweeney and Cam Neely be the ones that are overseeing this potential retool, hiring most likely another head coach, making these picks. If you're dealing Carlo, you're hopefully getting a first round pick back. Coyle, same thing. Marchand, same thing. So, I mean, again, you mentioned like if they somehow had, their own first round pick and then two others they got via trade. Are you comfortable with Sweeney making these first round picks? Are you comfortable with Neely in this staff overseeing these first round picks? And I think there is a legitimate case to be made of, are you comfortable with them also, hiring a new head coach? Now, I don't think ownership is moving on from Neely and Sweeney. I just don't. Everything the Jacobs have said, they have been in the playoffs every year for years now. They've gotten close a couple times. Like, I just don't think the ammo is there. I know fans are frustrated with Sweeney and Neely, but I don't think the ammo is there for those guys to get canned. I don't think it's there yet. Now, should they? I think the organization probably could use fresh eyes on draft picks and head coaches and signings going forward. Absolutely. I just don't think the front office is willing to do that, or not the front office, excuse me. Ownership is willing to do that yet.
Yeah, no. And again, if you had to ask me my prediction, right or wrong, I think Sweeney and Neely are both back. I think that
I would completely agree. I
think you look at
doing it.
And again, that will, I'm sure, raise an uproar with Bruins fans, but I can just, the way that I think ownership views it, and they obviously are very tight with them, I think that the pressure would be ramped up, but they're probably like, hey, we haven't had a retool since 2015. Did not go all that well in terms of restocking the pipeline, really, unfortunately. So you have to contend with that. But I think that Charlie Jacobs and the team's ownership would rather see, have that stability in place with those guys and give them that opportunity, as opposed to like, all right, shit goes haywire and they want to bring in fresh eyes for what could be a pivotal offseason where, again, if it's someone new, yes, that helps. But I could see, and I'm not saying this is how, I think the team could benefit from fresh eyes, but I could see ownership being like, well, we also threw in Sweeney in 15 when he was
Bingo.
not ready, and the scouting, everything was out of whack, and then they weren't ready for that draft. And again, look where it leads to them. It's something we've talked about over 10 years later on. So I think that is also something you have to contend with, of if this is going to be a really seismic offseason, and the pressure's already up on them, let's see what they can do and have that stability in place, as opposed to moving on from them, have a lot of moving pieces. You saw it kind of with the Patriots, of like a lot of just moving pieces, not ready. And it's not saying like they're just going to hire a 30-year-old GM, right? If they move on from Sweeney, but just new blood, new eyes that can help in the long term. But for right now, when you're looking the months ahead, maybe they view it more as having some stability in guys that have been there a while to tackle kind of untangling the mess they put themselves in. And if they can't do it next offseason, that gives it away. But and I think we can debate that, whether that's right or wrong. We'll probably have a lot of time this offseason to discuss that. But
Probably will.
I do think, if I was to guess right now where the Bruins ownership in them are looking at things, I imagine they lean more towards retaining them and being like, all right, what can you do to fix this? As opposed to like, all right, see ya.
Yeah, and you're right in that it's a consequential offseason, and bringing in a whole new staff to handle that is a lot. I also don't think Sweeney's a horrible GM. I don't. Like, I think the organization could use fresh eyes. Absolutely. He's been there a long time. But you got to make sure that the next general manager is better, is going to be better. Like, again, I don't have a GM ranking in front of me, but Sweeney's in the top 10. I'm not saying he's number 1 or number 2, but he's in there. He's got this team in it every year. So, like, you can't mess that up either. It was sort of like Bruce Cassidy, where it was like, yeah, maybe it was time. Maybe they need a new voice in the room, but he's objectively a really good coach. Really good coach. And he goes and wins a cup the next year. And I'm not saying Sweeney would go and just win a cup somewhere. Maybe he'd join us on, maybe, you know what? Maybe he'd join on the podcast. Maybe he'd be permanent co-host.
Yeah.
Great gig. That's an upgrade. That's a real upgrade from being the general manager of the Bruins.
Of course.
But I do think Sweeney's not a bad GM. I don't think he's bad. I don't. But there is the argument, and I see this too, if they need fresh eyes. And I think they could use fresh eyes as well. So, nonetheless, obviously Don Sweeney's going to be the one handling the deadline this week. I don't see any changes.
Yeah, that's not
week.
changing. Yeah.
Wednesday morning, I think that's what it's going to be. In closing, though, I mean, I think, I have a ton of names in front of me. Marchand, Frederick, Geekie, Brazeau, Pete, Korpisalo, Carlo, Coyle, Geekie. I think I mentioned Geekie twice in there. I think of those guys, like, I would put Frederick getting dealt high on that list. I think that happens. Brazeau, I would put there as well. Doesn't seem like he's coming back. That's giving you much. Again, what's his value? I don't know. Like, his value in the beginning of the year was much higher than it is now. And then you get into that next tier. Is Andrew Peeke a guy you move on from? Like, is the price not perfect for Carlo, but someone comes along and says, I'll give you a second for Andrew Peeke. And it's like, oh, okay. Like, all right, gets you back in the second round. Like, I don't hate that. Do you look at Korpisalo? Like, you'll probably have a bold prediction story at some point this week, so I don't want to have that given away. But, like, do you have any bold predictions for this week of things they might do, or just things you think maybe they aren't bold, but things they might do?
No, I mean, I think I said it earlier, but I think they're going to opt for more of a conservative approach. I just think it's going to depend on. I think they think that they can get back on track, and you can make the case that the best way to doing that is coming out of this with multiple draft picks and really kind of embracing tanking these last 20 games and getting again, if you get like a seventh overall and you're more in that territory of like a Frundell or a McQueen or someone like that, that is better than, where they are right now of like 11 to 14. I know it's not the deepest draft, but there are tiers, there are levels to this shit, Evan, as they say. And so I do think that is
tiers.
Yes, I do think that's something that plays into it, but I think it just comes down to the price, and I'm just not sure if the Bruins are going to get enough of those returns that are going to prompt them to move all these assets. Now, if we get to Friday and Carlo and Coyle and Geekie Antia, along with Frederick and Brazo, I think those guys are gone. But if these guys aren't there, but all of a sudden you got 2 firsts and 2 younger players and, something like that, then yeah, that's the right move. If that is the actual return you're going to get, I'm not sure how the market is going to be that those are going to be realistic options for them. I think the Bruins really need to be bowled over if teams are that desperate to get those guys off their hands. And if it's, again, Carlo for 2 seconds, I don't think you're doing that. If it's a first and a young player, or, time's really not on the Bruins side, but it's either you have to get knocked over with a deal, or you have to be really creative if you're packaging Carlo and Geekie, or you're putting Corpusalo with another player and stuff like that, and you're getting, NHL talent back. Like, that could be the case. But again, season's going on. Teams are looking elsewhere as well. It's not easy if that's also what you're trying to do. So I'm going to go 60%. That's going to be a pretty cautious Frederick Brazo, maybe someone else. And you sell off pieces and kind of just see where you are this summer as you make kind of the tougher decisions. But there's also a 40% chance of just chaos. And I think the one that is toughest for me to gauge, honestly, out of the Geekie and Carlo and all those guys is Marchand. Because I think I can't tell you where I think that contract's going to go. And if it is something where they are far apart and it's like it plays out kind of like the Stamkos thing where the Lightning really wanted him. He wanted to stay in Tampa, but it is a business, and Brisebois and them were not going to give him 4 years at $8 million per year. I'm not saying that Marchand's asking for that, but if it is like, I want to be here for 3-4 years at 6, right? Like
7,
then you are at an impasse. Because I feel like if it was like, I'll be here for 3 years, but I'll do it Patrice did. I'll do a 1 million. Like, of course the Bruins would be like, okay, yeah, that's fine.
Sign right here. No problem.
Even if like he really bottoms out or injuries really do catch up to him, 1 million, you live with that for a guy that I think even as he's, at this stage of his career, I think is easily going to be a 20 goal guy. Like, as long as he stays healthy, like he still brings you a lot of value. But I feel like if that was the parameters of these deals, it would have already been taken care of right now. Maybe that changes once you get to the 11th hour on Thursday of like, hey, this is what we have. Otherwise, we have to really start looking at these options here. Do you want to go somewhere else? Again, all it takes is one phone call, and stuff changes quickly. Hell, 2 years ago, we're like, all right, Jake DeBrus's getting traded, right? A contract extension. What the hell?
Yep.
Then once you get to the 11th hour, things can change on a whim. So I tend to lean more of, I think they're going to be more conservative with it, but do not hold me to that. When 4 guys have been traded and all of a sudden we're looking at 3 new players on the NHL roster and 2 more draft picks we got to start doing our research on, I would also not be surprised. But I think right now, just the way they are operating and how I think they can change things around pretty quickly, I think it's more of a conservative approach. But it can change on a whim, dude. If we're gonna record this and something's gonna happen. So.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I was looking at Twitter as you were talking because I'm like, I guarantee you something already dropped and nothing has. I think trading pieces who are valuable to this team just to trade them is a bad idea. Like, you just trade Carlo because you want to trade him, or Geekie or Coyle. I think it's a bad idea. I mean, Frederick Brazo, I get. But like, as we've said a number of times on the show, you need to make sure you're getting good value if you're trading valuable pieces. Now, for what I think they do, given the money they spent last offseason with Lindholm and Zadorov, even though those have not worked out, given the core guys that are here, given that they probably will have a new head coach next year, I think they can compete. And I think they do a little minor retool. I think that's what they do. I think it's, as you said, it's conservative, smaller moves. Obviously Frederick will be legitimate. I'm very interested to see what the return is. I don't see them going huge. Now, I'm with you. Who knows? Like, maybe they do. Maybe stuff opens up. Maybe Byfield really is available. And it's like, all right, let's gather the troops. We're going in. But just historically, especially with these kinds of things, their first year retooling in like 10 years, I just don't think they're going to come out, guns a-blazing. Maybe they do in the offseason. Maybe they make trades around the draft. Maybe we see ramifications later on at the draft of like, oh, we started those conversations at the deadline. But I don't foresee them actually pulling the trigger on a lot of the big stuff. I see them kind of going small and more expected moves. I do wonder, like, Marchand's obviously, I think, the most interesting one of the whole bunch. But like Peak and Korpisalo, I keep going back to, because like Peak is a third pairing right shot D on a really good playoff team. There are teams out there who need that. PK, like tough minutes, and will overpay. Korpisalo's a backup, but can handle a good amount of games. Like, rest the starter a little bit down the stretch. Teams will pay a lot for that. There are lots of teams with goaltending problems out there. Like Edmonton could use both. Edmonton could use both. Is that a partner? I also wonder, like with the Brandon Carlo to Calgary news, is that, I don't know. It would be more so the Bruins. It wouldn't be the Flames. But is that the Bruins kind of putting that out there to get Edmonton to get going? Like, we're close to Calgary. Edmonton, what do you got? I do wonder about that as well. So it'll be a fascinating week. I'm very interested to see the direction. I mean, we know they're going to sell. I don't think, they're going to be getting, the big fish. But how much do they sell is really the big question. And we're no closer to answering it. It's Monday afternoon.
Oh, wait. I'm just kidding.
You had me. Like, I actually, my heart skipped a beat. It's like, oh God, right at the 41st
Nothing
minute.
to report yet. So when this actually does drop in 2 hours and it's old news when
that's right,
Marchand gets traded or something, don't yell.
That's right. That'll be terrific. Well, until then, Connor, what can the people look forward to from you over at the Globe and Boston.com?
Yeah, you can read all my stuff over at theglobeandboston.com. We have covered every step of the way this Bruins season, especially this week with the trade deadline finally upon us. So you can read all of my stuff over there. If you want to follow me on Twitter, X, whatever it's called these days, you can at Conor Ryan _93.
Go do all that. The Bengals actually just placed the franchise tag on T. Higgins. So could T. Higgins be a board for the Bruins? Anyways, that is Bruins Beat. I'm Evan Marinofsky. That's Conor Ryan. You Bruins Beat listeners, have a great rest of your week.